Hi, I'm Jean Shafiroff, and I'm on a mission. Anyone can be a philanthropist. My television show came from my book, Successful Philanthropy: How to Make a Life by What You Give. Won't you join me? Welcome to Successful Philanthropy. I'm your host, Jean Shafiroff. This show is designed to highlight the work of philanthropic leaders here in the United States and then beyond. Today with us, Art Shamsky. And Art is best known as the iconic Major League Baseball player. Let's all welcome Art Shamsky. Art, it is really so great to have you with us. And Art, I want to start with your beginnings. I understand you graduated from high school at the age of 16. And then did you get involved in playing Major League Baseball right away? Or what exactly, how did you begin?
Well, first of all, Gene, it's my pleasure to be with you. It's a great show, and thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I grew up in the Midwest, originally from St. Louis, Missouri, suburbs of St. Louis. Yeah, I graduated very young. Actually, what happened was my parents moved from the city to the county, and somehow I lost a little bit of time in high school. And not that I was any smarter than anybody else to graduate that young, but it just worked out that way. I was in love with the game of baseball as a kid growing up. Of course, my team was the St. Louis Cardinals, and my dad was throwing baseballs to me as soon as I could walk. So I grew up in an area that was really a great area to develop young players, and was lucky enough at the time to have a lot of interest in me as I was playing high school ball and amateur baseball. And I went to the University of Missouri to play baseball, which at that time was a pretty good baseball school. Ended up getting hurt back in those days when it was cold out. You still went outside. There was no indoor facilities, and injured my hand. I had it operated on. That was the beginning of a number of injuries I had in my career, but didn't get a chance to play college baseball because I decided to become a professional baseball player at the age of 17, and decided to sign with the Cincinnati Reds at the time. And that time, you could sign with any team. There was no draft. And for those who might understand the game of baseball now, there's an amateur draft, and it's a little more complicated. Back then, you could sign with every team you wanted to. I liked the Cincinnati Reds, not so much because I got a little bit more money from them. There wasn't much money back then anyway, but they treated me really nice, and it was a great organization at the time. And I ended up signing with them. And as a matter of fact, I hate to even mention the year because it'll make me feel a lot older than I want to feel. But 1960 was my first year playing minor league baseball, and I played with some guys who went on to have fabulous careers in the big leagues, and including somebody everybody might know by the name of Pete Rose, and then Tony Perez, who's in the Hall of Fame. We were all together in the minor leagues. And for me, those years were wonderful years because, being young and being on your own for the first time in your life, and really kind of learning about life, actually. And so those years were really formidable years for me. And eventually I ended up getting traded to the Mets a year before we won the World Series, and my life changed when that happened, when we won the World Series in 1969. But those early years for me were really wonderful years, growing up, playing baseball, and then playing minor league baseball with some wonderful guys who ended up having great careers in the big league. So those great years for me growing up.
Yes, and so you were very young when you became a major star. And I know back in 1966, you had a very big batting success. Tell us about that. I think you broke all records, or almost broke all records.
Well, you're too kind. It was really one record. I ended up hitting 4 consecutive home runs in 4 at bats. And it's been done before, but what was unusual about it, I hit 3. It was over 2 games, and I hit 3 in one game, but I did not start the game. I did not come into the game until the 8th inning. And I ended up hitting a home run in the 8th, and then 2 in extra innings. And we were home at Crosley Field, which was the ballpark in Cincinnati. Both those home runs tied the game. We eventually lost that game in extra innings. So I think I'm the only person in baseball history that hit 3 in one game but didn't start the game. And then the next game, I ended up hitting another one that next at bat. So I hit 4 in a row. But the unusual part of it was the first game where I hit 3. and we lost that game, and two of them were in extra innings. So it was a little bizarre, but a lot of people know me about that. And fortunately, the bat I used to do that is on display in Baseball's Hall of Fame. And so for me, I get a lot of people who send fan letters or contact me or meet me and say, hey, I saw your bat in the Baseball Hall of Fame. So that's always kind of nice and to be part of that. But that particular record is very vivid in my mind. It's one of those things that when you think about it, and it didn't happen very often, the ball looked like it was the size of a softball. More often than not, though, the ball looked like it was the size of a ping pong ball. So that's how hard it is to hit a baseball. So I'm really happy about that record and proud that the bat's on display at the Baseball Hall of Fame. And thank you for bringing it up, because it's one of
Yeah.
a few of the things that I accomplished in baseball.
Now, in 1969, I believe you were part of the World Series. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, my life changed October 16th, 1969. I'm still in New York because of it. I got traded over to the Mets the winter of 1967. My first year here was 1968. And when I heard about the trade, when you get traded for the first time, it's always a shock. And you're leaving friends that you really kind of sort of grew up with. And when I heard about it, I was really there's a little bit of a story if I can talk about it. I had gotten operated on. It was the second of some major operations. I had hurt my back and had gotten operated on. I was with the Reds, and I got a call from the general manager, and I was in St. Louis at the time, and he said, I thought he was calling to see how I was feeling. And before he could say anything, I said to him, I'm really happy you called. I want you to know I'm feeling pretty good. And he said, well, that's great, because we just traded you today, this morning, to the New York Mets. Well, the first time you hear about yourself getting traded, it's always a shock, like I mentioned before. But when I heard it was to the New York Mets, I was in disarray, because the Mets at the time were an awful team. I didn't like New York. Mets were known as the lovable losers, came into existence in 1962, and every year they were losing 100 games. And so if you played against them like I did with the Reds, if you didn't beat them 2 out of 3 in games, at least 2 out of 3, you thought it was a bad series. So when I heard about that and really didn't like New York at the time, I was a little bit dismayed. But to make a long story short, next spring training when I joined the team, it was really an exciting point for me. It was a new endeavor, new teammates. Gil Hodges, a famous name in New York, was our manager. His first year there, my first year, a number of guys who came over at the same time. And that, was the beginning of my love affair with New York. As I didn't like it initially, fell in love with the city, and then we won the World Series the next year when nobody expected us to win. It was an unbelievable experience for all of us, because for those who remember that time, who were old enough to remember, it was an awful time in New York. The war in Vietnam was tearing the country apart. We're in a world that's upside down now. But back then, that war in Vietnam was really the thing that was really, the country was in turmoil. And every city, big city, was having financial problems, unrest, social unrest, like we're having now. But back then, it was a little bit different because of the war in Vietnam. And so when we won the World Series in 1969, which was the second of the 3 teams in New York to win championships that year, the Jets, then us, and the Knicks, my life changed that October day, and I've been to New York ever since. And there's not a day, and I'm really being honest about it, there's not a day goes by when somebody says hello to me, meets me, talks to me, and mentions 1969, because it was such an incredible year for all of us who were part of that team. And so the New York Mets have won 2 championships over the years. Both 1986 and 69 were significant in their own right, but 1969 was so special because of where we came from, a team that was almost last place the year before, winning the World Championship. And I've had so many people over the years tell me how we helped them get through some really awful times in their life, and in particular, some people that were in Vietnam who I've met over the years, who said, my gosh, we were in the worst place in the world, but you made us feel better about our lives because your team won. And the Mets, who are known, like I said, as the lovable losers, all of a sudden were world champions. And I've been in New York ever since, and gotten involved with so many different things. And I'm positive it's because I was part of that 69 team. You know,
Yes.
I played 13 years, and for all intents and purposes, nobody ever talks about the other 12. It's only about 1969.
Well, you are a real icon in the world of baseball, and you also have a heart. And of course, the Vietnam War was a horrible war with so many casualties, and as you say, so much unrest in the world at that time and in the United States, similar to what we've experienced recently. Now, after you left your baseball career, I believe you were with baseball for many, many years. You got involved in the real estate world, and then later on, you got involved as a sports newscaster, and then now as a podcaster. What was the most memorable and most exciting part of your life after baseball?
Well, it's interesting that you talk about that, Gene, because I was one of these guys who got out of the game relatively young because of injuries. I was not prepared. You think when you win the World Series in your mid 20s, it's gonna last forever. You're gonna be doing this till you're 50, and it never didn't happen that way. You have to stay healthy, and I was not able to stay healthy. I've had so many operations and injuries from sports, and so when I got out of the game, I was not prepared. And fortunately, I had some friends who kind of said, "Hey, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that?" And it was trial by error. And I got involved in a couple projects and a couple things, and broadcasting was really the most interesting for me because I got a chance to do things that I could relate to. And I worked at Channel 5 here in New York, was Metro Media at the time. I worked there 9 years, and I did the Mets games in '79, '80, and '81 as a color commentator. But off and on, I worked for WFAN, ESPN, Channel 11 here doing some sports. So for me, it was kind of a niche to be able to do that and keep my name out there and stay active in the world of sports. But I would say all the years that I post baseball career, and I did a lot of different things. It was in the restaurant business. One of these guys that just really didn't know what I wanted to do, but the niche I think was being still involved in sports and staying active in sports. And that's one of the reasons I decided to do the podcast over a year ago, because we were going through such a horrible time here in this country and the world with the pandemic, and I wanted to stay connected. I think I think what's important for me is staying connected with people and fans. You know, I think that old adage of out of sight, out of mind is really true. And so you have to stay active and stay visible and stay and do things you think that are important to people. Get involved in charities, do clinics. I do all that stuff just to stay active and stay busy. So I feel like it's important for me to, again, I just use this phrase. I want to be connected to fans and people because I think it's important. And I believe I have something to say. That experience of being on that championship team is so special, and it brings back so many memories to people and fans. And what's really interesting about that is that I meet young people, kids who weren't even born, who know about that 1969 team from their parents or their grandparents, and they know players' names, they know details, they know all the events that happened that year. And it's wonderful for me to be able to talk about it and relate to it because it was such a special time for me in my life.
Now, Art, you were also, or have been, and continue to be involved in philanthropy. And this show is all about leaders and then their philanthropy. Talk a little bit about your philanthropy and what was particularly meaningful to you.
Well, I'm one of these people that believes that you've got to give back something that because you've gained so much in your life. I'm very lucky to have been on that team that won the world championship, but also had an opportunity to play a game that I loved as a kid. And so for me, just being able to give back something to charities, to like I said, baseball clinics, whatever I can do to make people feel better about their lives, I'm all for. And so for me, I've gotten involved in a lot of things over the years, donated some memorabilia, a lot of my memorabilia at auctions for charities. And so and recently I lost a dear friend and a great member of that 1969 team, Tom Seaver, who died with because of Alzheimer's and dementia. And I've got another teammate, Bud Harrelson, who's now dealing with Alzheimer's. And so I'm very close to that particular disease and Parkinson's. I've got some friends who suffered from Parkinson's. So again, whatever I can do in my course of living in life, and I've got everything to be thankful for. I've got no qualms about the not making the money that they're making now. I don't even think about that any. That's not something I think about. It is what it is. I learned a long time ago that life is about being in the right place at the right time, and I was lucky enough to be in the right place and playing for a wonderful championship team that lives on forever. So for me, giving back and whatever I can do in terms of charity work and things of that nature, I'm very much interested in.
And for our audience, we are with Art Shamsky. He is an iconic former Major League Baseball player. He's had a long career in broadcasting and now has his own podcast. And he's speaking about his desire to give back, and he's done quite a bit in the world of philanthropy, especially in the area of Alzheimer's. And Art, it is so nice and to have you here. And I want you to talk a little bit now about the importance of your family in your life. And was it difficult to raise children while you had such an active career?
Well, it's actually true. Yeah, I got married very young. I was 20. My wife, believe it or not, was 17. Back in the 60s, a lot of people got married very young. Unfortunately, we were divorced, but we got divorced. But I have two beautiful children from that marriage and five grandchildren. All, unfortunately, are all gotten through school and much smarter than me. I must admit, Gene. They're all much smarter than me. But yeah, it's baseball life back in those days was tough. You were on the road a lot. But to give wives credit, they deal with a lot of ups and downs, the emotional stresses of every day in games, good games, bad games, and so it's not an easy life. But I've got again the wonderful children and grandchildren from that marriage, and so for me, it's been good, and knock on wood, everybody seems to be doing okay right now.
Art, you've written a few books, and I want you to talk about those two books because I started to do a little research, but I want to hear from you.
The first book was called The Magnificent Seasons. I mentioned it earlier, about 1969 and 70, when the three teams here in New York won championships, again, all for the first time, the Jets and the Mets, and then, of course, the Knicks in May of 70. So that was really a labor of love. And you talk about, you mentioned earlier about the time that made those three teams so special was what was going on in the city and the country and the world at the time. I did a lot of timeline events underlying certain games of each one of the teams, and I never could find any good news. I spent hours upon hours at the New York Times library looking for certain articles, just something to coincide with what happened that day, that particular game, or that day in the season, and never found any good news. As a matter of fact, I remember the New York Knicks, and I believe they won the championship May 8th in 1970, and May 5th of that year, they had the shootings at Kent State, where our National Guard shot and killed five students and wounded, I believe, eight. And so that was the kind of news that was going out in the world at the time in this country. And so for all of the teams, those three teams, we all feel like we contributed something to making the feelings in New York and the country people feel better about what was going on. And so that book called The Magnificent Season was very, very special. And I really enjoyed writing that. The second book is called After the Miracle, and that came out 2019, 2 years ago, and it coincided with the 50th anniversary of the 1969 Mets. I can't believe it's been 52 years now that team won a championship, but that book was really a very special, dear to my heart. So many books have been written about the 1969 Mets, more than any team in the history of sports. I really believe that. And so when I decided to write it, along with a terrific writer by the name of Eric Sherman, we just didn't want to write a book about the season and the day-to-day things that happened during the year. We decided to write it about the camaraderie and the friendship that developed over the years and still remains with the players that are still around. We've lost 10 or 11 players from that team, from the team that was in the World Series, including coaches and our terrific manager, Gil Hodges. But there's still a nucleus of players around, and we wanted to write a book that talked about how we developed this relationship. And part of it is because of how bad that team was. And when you come from nowhere to win, it makes it that much better. If
It
you're
was
expected to win, if you're expected to win and you win, it's still great, but it doesn't have that same meaning as where you came from almost being in last place one year to the next year. And so for me, writing that book really was very special. And I've gotten, it made the New York Times bestseller list. And so many really wonderful comments about this sentimental journey we took and to do this book. And the way it all came about is myself, Eric Sherman, and three other former players went out to visit Tom Seaver, who was a great pitcher on the team and the best player on the team. And at that time, he was ill. He wasn't traveling. We took this trip out to California, where he lived out in Calistoga, the wine country. He was in the wine business, and we spent a day out there reminiscing about how it changed our lives. That team changed our lives, and how important it was to be part of that team. And it was a sentimental journey about that trip. It's not about Tom Seaver in itself, but it's about the trip and how close we became as teammates. And I still get a lot of comments. It's on my website that people can buy it, and I can sign a personal salutation. And so for me, that book is very, very special, and a labor of love, I have to say, because it brought back so many memories, and it's a little bit of a tearjerker in some sense, because it does talk about some things and the people that we lost along the way. But knock on wood, there's still a number of the guys around, and for me, it was always special, and it will always be special to be part of that team and write that book.
And tell us a little bit about your podcast. Is that for baseball lovers, or is that a little bit about life? What exactly do you talk about in your podcast?
Well, I gave it this very original name, the Art Shamsky Podcast, and it's on all the major podcast platforms. When I decided to do it, again, I wanted to connect with the fans. But interestingly enough, I just didn't want to do baseball or sports only. So I've decided to do, a combination of sports and entertainment, and have fun with it. And when you talk about some of the icons that I've interviewed, like Joe Namath, and I interviewed Cardinal Dolan, and I've interviewed so many well-known people. What do you ask these people that haven't been asked before? And so what I try to do is just draw out something from them that they haven't talked about. It's interesting enough. Just to use an example, Joe Namath, when I interviewed him over a year ago, neither one of us knew how to do Zoom. We've kind of figured a way to do it. We both had to get some help, and I was talking to Joe, and I said, tell me about something that somebody hasn't asked you. And he said, I was a pretty good baseball player. Now, Joe Namath, we all know, is a great New York football player, Hall of Fame. He's the face of the NFL. And he said, I was a good baseball player. I had a chance to sign with I forget the name of the team. He said 4 or 5 teams wanted to sign me. And I said, you mean you could have been a Major League Baseball player? He said, well, what happened one day over dinner, his mom and his brother were sitting around. I don't know if his dad had passed away or he wasn't around, but he said, I think I might want to play baseball to them. And they both slammed their fists down on the table and said, no, you're not going to play baseball because you're going to go to college. He ended up going to Alabama, All-American there, became star player with the New York Jets. But I just like to find things out like that, because I think fans are interested in that, because what else can you ask Joe Namath about that hasn't been asked? But that's what I try to do. I do a combination of sports and entertainers, and it's been a lot of fun.
Do you have any regrets? We have about 1 minute left. And as you look back on your life, is there something you wish you had done?
Well, I think there's always regrets. I wish I would have been a better player. I wish I'd have stayed healthier. If I had to do it all over again, I would work harder at my craft. You got to a point sometimes where you take things for granted. I knew that I was in a group of elite people, that there was only a certain amount of players that make it to that level. But I remember batting in the World Series very, very briefly. I was batting in the World Series, and I was on the on-deck circle, and I said, I had a second to pause, and I said to myself, all those days my dad played catch with me, all those days that I played baseball with my friends, all those high school games, all those American Legion games, all those amateur games, all those bus trips that I took in the minor leagues. that was something in itself. And all those days that you practiced to get to this point in your life, to be in the World Series, and as a kid, that's all you ever dream of. And I said to myself, gosh, if I could do it over again, I'd work harder and definitely try to stay healthier. But I have no regrets. Have had a great life. People say to me, "Don't you wish you were playing now, making all the money?" And I say it's great, but I wouldn't trade it for the World Series, a ring I've got with the 1969 Mets and the people I met along the way, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. So I've really got no regrets. It's been a good ride for me, and I can hopefully continue for a few more years doing what I'm doing and talking to wonderful people like yourself and being able to help and do whatever I can to make people's lives a little bit better.
And finally, one last question. We have a lot of young people who want to get involved in a baseball career or another career. One piece of advice, if you had to give one piece of advice, what would that be?
I would say follow your dream. What might look like very difficult times ahead, if you love something and dedicate it to it, something will happen positive. I tell kids all the time when I do these clinics, not every one of you is going to make it to the major leagues. I hope you do, but not every one of you will. But if you have a desire, you have a passion for something, if you love something, just work at it. You can have a friend throw ground balls to you, practice, throw pop-ups to yourself, practice things that are going to make you better. And if it's not sports, whatever that might be, work at your craft, because there's nothing better than the satisfaction you get out of having worked hard for something and it came to fruition. And I've had the best of both worlds. I became a professional baseball player. I played in the World Series and was on a winning team in the World Series. So that would be my best advice, and just work hard at something you really have passion for.
Art, thank you very much for joining us. This concludes Successful Philanthropy. Our guest today, Art Shamsky. He's a former Major League Baseball icon. I'm Jean Shafiroff, your host. I'll see you next week.